Bom dia a todos e a todas. O Laboratório de Inovações Financeiras LAB, no Brasil, agradece a presença e dá as boas-vindas a todos os participantes deste webinário, que trata das perspectivas de cover bonds e secure notes para o financiamento do desenvolvimento sustentável. O evento conta com tradução simultânea para inglês e português. El evento cuenta con traducción simultánea al inglés y al español. Simplemente acceder al icono del globo terráqueo interpretación, ubicado en la parte inferior de la pantalla. The event has simultaneous translation into English and Spanish. Just access the icon for the globe interpretation here, located at the bottom of the screen. Now I switch to Portuguese. Esse evento está dividido em duas partes. A primeira parte, referente à mesa de abertura e intervenção do BID, será ministrada em português. A segunda parte, referente ao painel internacional, intitulado Mercado de Cover Bonds e European Security Notes, Estrutura Regulatória e Perspectivas, será ministrado em inglês. Para este painel, será possível encaminhar perguntas por meio do ícone Questions and Answers, Q&A, localizado abaixo da tela. As perguntas poderão ser respondidas ao fim do respectivo painel. Para aqueles que preferirem acompanhar esse painel em português, basta acessar o ícone do globo terrestre na parte inferior da tela. Informo, por último, que este evento está sendo gravado e estará disponível na página do greenfinancelac.org. Para compor a mesa de abertura e iniciar sua intervenção, eu convido o representante do Grupo BID no Brasil, Sr. Morgan Doyle.
Muito obrigado, Rodrigo. Bom dia a todos e a todas que nos acompanham nesta manhã. Bom dia, meus colegas, parceiros do LAB, do Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, iniciativa que mantemos ao lado dos meus caros Marcelo Barboso, presidente do CVM, Sérgio Guzmão, presidente da ABDE, e Michael Rosenauer, diretor nacional do GIZ aqui no Brasil. Em nome do Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento, gostaria de agradecer o empenho das suas instituições nessa parceria que tem rendido frutos tão memoráveis. Só para citar um par deles, o LAB, o ano passado, se tornou o primeiro membro sul-americano da Rede Internacional de Centros Financeiros para a Sustentabilidade, que é um marco muito importante. E as discussões conduzidas no LAB ajudaram a formatar o decreto 10387, aprovado o ano passado no Brasil, abrindo caminho para projetos relacionados à infraestrutura serem contemplados por debêntures incentivados. De modo similar, esperamos que os debates que conduziremos hoje, abordando covered bonds e as European Structured Notes, resultem logo mais em instrumentos financeiros de uso corrente na América Latina. Antes de começar e de comentar mais sobre essas oportunidades, eu gostaria realmente agradecer também aos participantes dos painéis que teremos hoje. O senhor Juan Ketter, chefe da divisão de conectividade e mercado de finanças do BID, grande amigo meu, que também estará representado pelas especialistas Rafael Cavazzoni Lima e Maria Neto. Luco Bertalot, secretário-geral da European Covered Bond Council, que está conosco hoje, Richard Kemish, especialista em Covered Bonds e European Secured Notes, e Agustin Martin Calmarsa, analista do BBVA. Estamos muito felizes de contar com a presença de todos vocês conosco hoje. Sabemos que combinar as visões, além das bagagens, né, de cada um de vocês, traz é fundamental para impulsionar modalidades de investimento cada vez mais atrativos e seguros. É importante lembrar que ainda não sabemos onde irá parar a demanda elevada de gastos nas áreas de saúde e, em geral, as pressionadas contas públicas, que estão aumentando a dificuldade para serem financiado uma série de dispensas no mundo inteiro. Nesse cenário, criar um ambiente atrativo para investidores é um desafio super relevante, igualmente necessário. E por isso que a conversa desta manhã é tão importante. Covered bonds e as European Secured Notes podem ser muito estratégicos exatamente para aumentar a segurança para os investidores, algo de extrema relevância. Isso acontece porque esses instrumentos oferecem uma dupla garantia para os títulos emitidos, colocando uma carteira de ativos de alta qualidade como lastro. além das seguranças oferecidas pelo próprio emissor. O potencial desse mecanismo é realmente imenso quando pensamos em iniciativas que podem se beneficiar de investimento de capital, né, de longo prazo, mediano e longo prazo, como financiamento para PMEs ou de iniciativas ligadas aos objetivos de desenvolvimento sustentável. Falamos, sem dúvida, de segmentos de extrema importância que nem sempre conseguem financiamento. A pesquisa organizada pelo Sebrae em maio do ano passado, ou seja, já durante a pandemia, revelou que apenas 1 de cada 7 micro, pequenas e medianas empresas que tentou conseguiu crédito aqui no Brasil. 1 de cada 7. Trata-se de um setor responsável por quase 60% das vagas do trabalho formais no Brasil. E o resto da região tem cifras ainda mais expressivas. É justamente a relevância pela urgência para ampliarmos o leque de mecanismos para destravar as possibilidades de crédito que estamos tão engajados nessa discussão hoje. Além deste webinar, quero destacar que os esforços do BID para impulsionar este modelo incluirão o lançamento de uma publicação sobre a chamada Letra de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, que usa a mesma lógica, ou seja, garantida por uma carteira de ativos temáticos. Convoco a todos que estão aqui conosco hoje a se inscreverem aqui no link que vamos colocar a ser distribuído no chat desta reunião, para receber informações do BID, que são totalmente gratuitos. Se vocês gostariam de receber informações das mais variados temas de conhecimento, por favor, sinta-se à vontade para se inscreverem lá. Além da questão do crédito, que mencionei há pouco, pensando na matéria mais ampla, estamos diante de formatos que podem nos ajudar a mobilizar recursos para chegarmos aos famosos 2,5 trilhões de dólares anuais que o mundo precisa ao ano para cumprir com os objetivos de desenvolvimento sustentável. Sabemos que todos aqui presentes são conscientes da urgência dessas ações. Essa é uma agenda prioritária para o BID e prioritária para todos os nossos parceiros. É bom saber que não estamos sozinhos nessa caminhada. Muito bom evento para todos e muito obrigado. Devolvo a palavra para você, Rodrigo. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Sr. Morgan Doyle. Convido a integrar essa mesa e iniciar a sua intervenção o senhor Marcelo Barbosa, presidente da Comissão de Valores Mobiliários do Brasil, CVM.
Muito obrigado, Rodrigo. E eu me junto aqui ao Morgan Doyle, já um amigo nesses tempos de pandemia. Nós ainda não tivemos a oportunidade de estar juntos pessoalmente, mas já participamos de tantas conversas pelo canal virtual aqui que já foi rápido percebermos, né, Morgan, o nosso alinhamento aqui com relação aos objetivos e a tanta coisa que a gente pode fazer e aí falo aqui dentro do nosso mandato aqui da CVM, mas pelo desenvolvimento da economia brasileira, que eu tenho certeza que são iniciativas replicáveis em outros países também. E também saúdo aqui os nossos parceiros de Lab, parceiros nessa abertura aqui dos trabalhos, tanto o Sérgio aqui pela BDS, Sérgio Guzmão, e Michael Rosenau pela GIZ, e que são realmente essas 4 instituições que estão aqui representadas têm feito, acho que, um trabalho de excelente qualidade na discussão, na reflexão sobre o potencial que existe de instrumentos de impacto, instrumentos sustentáveis no financiamento da economia. Esse é o caminho do crescimento da economia no futuro. Aqui, de nosso lado, nós temos acompanhado com otimismo o desenvolvimento dessas discussões. Existem estudos que apontam que no Brasil existe um potencial de cerca de 1,3 trilhão de dólares para investimentos em energia, transportes, construções, tratamento de resíduos, tudo isso com base nos compromissos climáticos assumidos pelo país no Acordo de Paris. E essas infraestruturas elas vão requerer investimentos muito relevantes em capital e podem ficar expostas a riscos de mudanças climáticas com perdas futuras se não forem feitas de maneira consistente. Ao mesmo tempo, existe uma estimativa de uma geração de PIB adicional de 2,8 trilhões de reais e mais de 2 milhões de empregos até 2030 com desenvolvimento de economia verde. Isso é capaz de atrair mais investimentos, reduzir desigualdades e proporcionar maior competitividade para a economia brasileira. Nos dá muita satisfação ver esse potencial ser realizado com apoio nos instrumentos de mercado de capitais. Esse é o nosso mandato, é desenvolver o mercado de capitais no Brasil em toda a sua variedade, em toda a sua plenitude, para que, através do crescimento e do aprofundamento, da solidificação do mercado de capitais, os seus instrumentos possam financiar o desenvolvimento da economia nacional. Essa é a nossa meta aqui nesse âmbito. Só que, para isso, nós temos que travar discussões como as várias que travamos juntos no Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, o nosso LAB, a respeito do desenvolvimento de melhores práticas e propósitos socioambientais e, com isso, a gente contribuir para a atração de mais investimentos e robustez desse mercado. Nesse caso aqui, pela promoção das finanças sustentáveis. Nós vimos, a CVM vem atuando nessas tendências, ao mesmo tempo em que a gente discute o desenvolvimento e a criação de instrumentos novos, e vamos discutir alguns hoje, esse é o tema principal, nós procuramos também dar maior transparência às práticas adotadas pelos emissores aqui de títulos, né, no mercado de capitais brasileiro. Nesse sentido, a audiência pública que nós lançamos já há algum tempo, e o período de contribuições se encerrou há pouco, sobre a reforma da Instrução 480. E nessa reforma nós estamos sugerindo, colocando para o debate público, o aumento da transparência por parte desses emissores a respeito de suas práticas relacionadas aos temas da importantíssima agenda ESG. Além disso, no âmbito do LAB também, existe um grupo de trabalho específico de finanças verdes com subgrupos temáticos em energia, agricultura sustentável e saneamento, e um subgrupo transversal com iniciativas para disseminação de conhecimento em taxonomias sustentáveis, mercado de carbono e, finalmente, a discussão de produtos financeiros sustentáveis. E aí o LAB vem estudando como se pode replicar ou criar produtos que possam alavancar mais investimentos sustentáveis no mercado, tentando antecipar a identificação de barreiras e já possíveis soluções para essas barreiras, para esses obstáculos. E aí, nesse subgrupo, que surgiram discussões sobre produtos financeiros, e daí a ideia desta discussão que vai se tratar hoje, logo na sequência dessa abertura, com especialistas. Nós temos um mercado em ascensão de dívidas corporativas específicas, títulos temáticos chamados sustentáveis, e com essas experiências, tanto na captação bancária quanto em modelagens que usem securitização, nós podemos encontrar complementos para a possibilidade de investimentos sustentáveis e, assim como eu disse, contribuir para o fortalecimento do mercado financeiro e de capitais sustentável no Brasil. Então, novamente, eu saúdo a iniciativa desse debate que se seguirá, congratulo todos os participantes, os especialistas, a quem agradeço por sua disposição de participar nesse evento e desejo à nossa audiência um bom evento e um bom dia. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, senhor Marcelo Barbosa. Convido a integrar essa mesa e iniciar sua intervenção o senhor Sérgio Guzmão, presidente da Associação Brasileira de Desenvolvimento, a BDE.
Obrigado, Rodrigo. Bom dia a todos e a todas. Um prazer estar participando desse importante evento internacional, sobretudo nessa mesa de abertura que reúne 4 instituições fundamentais. Temos um Banco Multilateral de Desenvolvimento, o Banco Interamericano, de Desenvolvimento, representado aqui pelo nosso querido amigo Morgan Doyle. Temos a Comissão de Valores Mobiliários, né, representada pelo Dr. Marcelo Barbosa, e temos também uma agência internacional, né, de cooperação, né, uma agência de um país, que no caso é a Alemanha, a GIZ, representada aqui pelo Dr. Michael, né, e a BDE representando 31 instituições financeiras de desenvolvimento, mais o SEBRAE e a FINEP, espalhadas por todo o território nacional. Então, são parceiros com DNA absolutamente complementares, né, no sentido de mobilizar instrumentos e recursos para o financiamento ao desenvolvimento aqui no Brasil, desenvolvimento sustentável. Nós temos um compromisso na implementação com os 17 Objetivos do Desenvolvimento Sustentável, um compromisso que o Brasil participa desde o seu início, desde 2015, juntamente com outras 2 agendas importantes do financiamento sustentável, trazidas também pelo Acordo de Paris, que trata das mudanças climáticas, né, mas que possui no seu artigo 6 o tema do mercado de carbono, um tema que está voltando com muita força, e também a agenda de financiamento ao desenvolvimento de Addis Abeba. Então, nós estamos trabalhando perto do terreno, né, financiando projetos, conhecendo essa diversidade imensa que existe no nosso país e, sobretudo, trabalhando com instrumentos inovadores. E é nesse sentido que se insere a nossa iniciativa tão relevante do Lab, já citada com muita propriedade pelo Morgan, pelo Dr. Marcelo, no sentido de mobilizar hoje mais de 400 instituições, né, para apoiar e criar soluções inovadoras em finanças sustentáveis e também outros temas de inovação financeira, com os exemplos já bem colocados pelo Morgan, né? No que tange o tema do Covered Bonds e Secured Notes, eu acho que um destaque muito especial, levando em consideração as características do Brasil, né, os desafios do ponto de vista do nosso rating, do ponto de vista de projetos de longo prazo que nós precisamos financiar e encontrar soluções pragmáticas, né? Então, esses mecanismos, eles oferecem o de-risking que já vem sido adotados em vários países do mundo com grande volume e grande sucesso e, sobretudo, quando tange o financiamento de atividades e projetos alinhados aí a 169 metas dos 17 ODS. A gente entende que os covered bonds têm sido um instrumento fundamental para canalizar esses fundos, né, muitas vezes de origem privada, né, por meio de emissão de títulos. A gente está vendo uma nova leva de emissões de títulos verdes, inclusive por bancos de desenvolvimento, né, e aí fazemos referência à experiência do BNDES, fazemos a referência à experiência do próprio Banco de Desenvolvimento de Minas Gerais, que eu também tenho a oportunidade de presidir, na emissão do primeiro título sustentável, né, registrado em Nova York, numa operação de private placement, com apoio aí fundamental do Grupo BID, né? Então, fazendo um agradecimento à equipe que está aqui hoje, que participou diretamente desse apoio, dessa jornada tão relevante e pioneira, né? E colocando, então, bancos de desenvolvimento na vanguarda do tema da transição energética, do tema da adaptação e mitigação de ativos no que tange às mudanças climáticas e, sobretudo, no financiamento dos objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável, no que nós já estamos no que é a década de ação para chegarmos no ano de 2030, né, que é o horizonte temporal aí que temos pela frente. É importante lembrar também que é uma época em que o sistema financeiro internacional vive elevada liquidez e precisamos criar instrumentos que tragam confiança, credibilidade para os investidores de maneira a mobilizar esses recursos para esse tipo de financiamento sustentável no Brasil, como bem colocaram os meus antecessores aqui e colegas de painel. O Sistema Financeiro Nacional, que é representado pela BDE, tem esse engajamento. Hoje nós representamos mais de 75% do financiamento à infraestrutura no Brasil e também uma parcela muito significativa do financiamento das micro e pequenas empresas, inclusive aquelas lideradas por mulheres. Portanto, crédito no tema de gênero muito importante para nós. Nós aumentamos mais do que dobramos as nossas captações internacionais de 2019 para 2020 e muitas vezes mais temos aí no pipeline captações para o ano de 2021 com uma miríade de parceiros internacionais, sendo bancos multilaterais de desenvolvimento, agências de desenvolvimento de países específicos, de maneira que a oportunidade está dada. O que nós precisamos é ter os instrumentos adequados e operá-los em escala, com pragmatismo, com sofisticação financeira, de maneira a poder mobilizar das pontas mais distantes, né, os novos pools de capitais, né, investidores institucionais com apetite para esse tipo de ativos e atuarmos na ponta em escala para podermos transformar a realidade. Então, esse é o nosso compromisso, o compromisso da Associação Brasileira de Desenvolvimento. É uma jornada de discussão, somos também uma plataforma de conhecimento, de trocas, né, com os parceiros que estão aqui presentes. Então, eu gostaria de, primeiramente, agradecer todos que estão aqui no painel de início, que são grandes parceiros nossos, e renovar esse compromisso de atuar em escala na ponta, né, como bancos de última milha, na mobilização desses recursos, né? Inclusive, tema que será aí objeto do nosso Fórum Brasileiro de Desenvolvimento, que ocorrerá no final de abril, desculpe, e para o qual todos aí estarão presentes conosco e já convidados. Portanto, vamos juntos nessa jornada e estou aqui bastante curioso para ouvir os especialistas e aprender um pouco mais sobre o tema de covered bonds e secured notes e as experiências e casos internacionais. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, Sr. Sérgio Guzmão. Convido a integrar essa mesa agora e iniciar sua intervenção o Sr. Michael Rosenauer, diretor nacional da GIZ Brasil.
Muito obrigado, Rogério. Muito bom dia a todas e todos. Agradeço o convite para compartilhar breves palavras nesse importante evento. É uma satisfação dividir a abertura com meus colegas representantes do grupo gestor do Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, com Marcelo Barbosa, presidente do CDM, Sérgio Guzmão, presidente da Associação Brasileira de Desenvolvimento, e com Morgan Doyle, representante do Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento no Brasil. Na verdade, é um prazer estar aqui com vocês. Bom, eu mesmo, Michael Rosenauer, desde mais de 30 anos laborando aqui, não aqui em Brasil, mas na empresa GIZ, a empresa de cooperação técnica alemã, presentes em mais de 120 países do mundo. Originalmente especialista em água e saneamento, mas desde 2018 diretor da GIZ aqui no Brasil. Atualmente, a GIZ aqui em Brasil implementa mais de 43 projetos bilaterais, regionais, e, além disso, muitos pacotes de projetos globais, focalizados em esses temas importantes como energia renováveis, eficiência energética, floresta, bioeconomia, biodiversidade, desenvolvimento urbano, formação técnica e mudança do clima. Para isso, contamos com mais de 200 profissionais nacionais e internacionais, assim como com muitos parceiros institucionais brasileiros e internacionais. Em particular, gostaria de fazer também menção do nosso projeto Finanças Brasileiras Sustentáveis, a sigla FIBRAS, financiado por nosso Ministério da Cooperação Alemão, BMZ, é implementado em parceria com o Ministério da Economia do Brasil, o Banco Central do Brasil e vários outros parceiros, muitos deles representados aqui hoje. O projeto busca fomentar e desenvolver as finanças sustentáveis, assim como aumentar o nível de investimentos verdes e sustentáveis no mercado financeiro nacional. Há 2 anos, por isso, a GIZ, através do FIBRAS, estabeleceu uma parceria com o Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, a maior e seguramente mais importante plataforma de diálogo multissectorial do Brasil, na busca pela inovação e pela sustentabilidade no mercado financeiro brasileiro. A GIZ, no centro de sua atuação, procura sempre promover a integração e troca de experiências para alcançar objetivos comuns. O ambiente proporcionado pelo Lab, como cerca de 250 instituições e mais de 830 participantes, é, sem dúvida, fundamental na busca pela transformação do mindset do mercado financeiro brasileiro, em direção a uma economia mais verde e sustentável. O diálogo e a cooperação internacional são fundamentais para o desenvolvimento de enquadramentos e soluções financeiras eficientes e sustentáveis. É, portanto, um grande prazer que o projeto promoveu a adesão do Banco Central ao Network for Greening the Financial System, assim como a adesão do LAB ao Financial Centers for Sustainability. Sabemos que alcançar a sustentabilidade econômica exige de todos os atores envolvidos uma evolução e uma inovação bastante intensa. Atingir as metas previstas no Objetivo de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, ODS, das Nações Unidas, de acordo com estimativas da ONU, irá custar cerca de 2,5 trilhões de dólares anuais, apenas considerando os países em desenvolvimento. Se somamos aos esforços necessários para cumprir as metas acordadas no Acordo de Paris, a estimativa da OECD é de serão necessários 6,9 trilhões de dólares anuais, apenas em termos de infraestrutura. A mobilização desse nível de recurso nos parece algo distante e difícil de ser atingido, principalmente se pensamos apenas em investimentos públicos. Assim, o único caminho que nos parece possível é a combinação de recursos públicos com os recursos privados. Será necessária uma transformação de fluxos tradicionais de financiamento e investimento, sendo que a integração de critérios de sustentabilidade no sistema financeiro e nos produtos financeiros existentes é parte desse caminho a ser trilhado. Quando falamos sobre mercado financeiro e sustentabilidade, talvez a primeira imagem que nos venha à cabeça sejam os green bonds, os títulos verdes. Presentes no mercado desde 2007, green bonds foram e ainda são instrumentos financeiros fundamentais no processo de evolução sustentável do mercado financeiro. No entanto, nem títulos nem créditos verdes representam novos produtos financeiros por si só. São instrumentos que já existiam e que exigem cada vez mais a internalização de critérios de sustentabilidade como benefício adicional. Este evento hoje busca trazer para a pauta do debate formas de garantia que possam reduzir o risco real ou a percepção de risco e aumentar, assim, a mobilização de investidores em projetos e iniciativas sustentáveis. Assim, o instrumento como covered bonds e secured notes em si também não são novos, mas a evolução destes, por meio da integração de critérios de sustentabilidade, pode ter o potencial de aumentar ainda mais o fluxo de financiamento em direção ao desenvolvimento sustentável. Agradeço ao BIT pela forte liderança regional na promoção do diálogo e de novas ferramentas e instrumentos financeiros, assim como na mobilização de recursos em prol do desenvolvimento sustentável da América Latina. No Brasil, vale destacar a atuação da ABGE e de seus associados na busca pela integração dos aspectos objetivos de ODS em seus processos, iniciativas, essa implementada também em parceria com o projeto Fibras. E, por fim, não menos importante, o CVM, regulador responsável pelo mercado de capitais no Brasil, que é um ator importante e que vem promovendo a inovação e a busca por uma economia mais sustentável. Os instrumentos aqui discutidos têm o potencial de trazer um novo nível de inovação para todos esses atores. É uma satisfação de ter todos vocês como parceiros na busca por uma economia mais sustentável no Brasil. Tenham todos um ótimo evento. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado, senhor Michael Rosenauer. Convido agora o senhor Juan Ketterer, chefe de divisão de conectividades, mercados e finanças do BID, para suas palavras sobre a visão do BID acerca dos mecanismos de de-risking para promover o mercado de títulos temáticos na América Latina e no Caribe. Juan, o senhor está no mudo. Obrigado.
Ok, obrigado. Muito obrigado, Rodrigo. E muito obrigado também a todos os parceiros e amigos que hoje estão aqui con nosotros e nos acompañan nesta actividade. É un grande prazer estar aquí con vocês para falar de un dos máis importantes temas dos mercados de capitais da última generación, os mercados de títulos verdes e mecanismos de de-risking. Estes mercados son moito importantes para evitar que a nosa geração seja a última geração no planeta. Bom, afortunadamente, o mercado global de títulos verdes e temáticos cresceu rapidamente en termos de volume e variedade ao longo da última década, atingindo atualmente un montante agregado de cerca de $1 trillón. Na América Latina e o Caribe, a emisión de títulos temáticos, incluyendo verdes, sociais e sustentáveis, tamén expandiu en volumen e variedade, acumulando aproximadamente 21,5 billones. En 2020, a emisión de títulos verdes alcanzou un valor recorde de máis de 250 billones nos mercados internacionais. Embora sexa unha tendencia da región de América Latina e o Caribe, aínda há dois aspectos que inhiben o desenvolvimento dese mercado. En primer lugar, o perfil do risco do título temático e, segundo, os custos de transacción asociados como emisión e relatoría dos títulos verdes. En primer lugar, há diferentes maneiras de aprimorar o perfil do risco de títulos verdes, a partir do uso de colaterais, de garantías de crédito, especialmente aquellas concedidas por terceiros mellor clasificados en relación ao risco, como os bancos multilaterais de desenvolvimento que ten un rating AAA. Por outro lado, custos crescentes de transacción poden advir tamén de, primeiro, alto costo de conformidade legal, o compliance, como se fala en inglés. Segundo, un alto costo asociado como a estructuración operacional dos títulos verdes. E terceiro, o costo de monitoramento e reporte dos investimentos suxacentes nas operacións financeiras. Todo iso é un cúmulo de circunstancias que facen que o mercado non se desenvolva como se podería desenvolver en seu potencial máis amplio. Os instrumentos financeiros adecuados para monitoramento e reporte son esenciais para alavancar o potencial do mercado de especie, principalmente na región. Nese sentido, o BID ha desenvolvido a plataforma de transparencia de títulos verdes, tamén conocida en inglés como Green Bond Transparency Platform, como objetivo de apoiar a harmonización e padronización da información reportada en operacións de títulos verdes na región, de modo de atraer novos inversores para ese tipo de títulos emitidos en América Latina e o Caribe. Esa iniciativa baseada na Distributed Ledger Technology debe prover acceso a información precisa e actualizada sobre cada emisión do título verde, o uso dos recursos e o impacto ambiental, além de ajudar a garantir a confianza aos investidores sobre o investimento efectuado e comparabilidade entre diferentes negocios. No próximo mes de abril terá lugar o lanzamento formal da plataforma e todo o mundo aquí presente está invitado a participar tamén. Este webinar, a propósito, presenta experiencia de mecanismos ben sucedidos de de-risking, muito tradicionais en mercados globais, que son covered bonds e secure notes. Ambos son títulos garantidos por unha carteira de activos que pode ser executada en caso de evento de inadimplencia, provendo aos titulares do título unha dupla garantía, representada pelo emisor, pela folla de balanzo do emisor, e o patrimonio do emisor e pela propia carteira de activos submetida a un régimen fiduciario. Ao contrario dunha operación de securitización, tanto a dívida quanto a carteira de activos asociada a un cover bond ou a un secure note permanecen no balanzo patrimonial da institución emisora. Es decir, o risco non é transferido do emisor para o investidor. Eso é moito máis eficiente que as securitizações. No caso das secure notes, referidos instrumentos poden viabilizar un nicho de financiamento situado entre o cover bond tradicional e unha securitización de activos de alta cualidade crediticia, a utilizar unha estructura de unha operación de dupla garantía para o financiamento de máis longo prazo de pequeñas e medianas empresas e potencialmente outras clases de activos para infraestructura sustentável, para oportunidades de adaptación ao proceso de mudanzas climáticas, etc. Ademais, ambos títulos de crédito, similares por su naturaleza, máis usados para diferentes tipos de investimento, tamén presentan características anticíclicas ao combinar unha estructura legal e regularmente robusta a dupla garantía e un proceso de disclosure padronizado. A identificación de credenciales verdes ou sustentáveis para activos financeiros ten o potencial de transformar o foco de crédito, resaltando os criterios verde e sustentável da operación financeira e criando novos requisitos para a documentación do programa e disclosure. A pesar do crecente número de emisores, aínda há moito espazo para crecimento dese mercado. O volume de cover bonds verdes aínda representa unha reducida fracción dese mercado. Isto posto, pode esperarse que unha maior demanda por mecanismos de de-risking, como os cover bonds e secure notes, cause algún efecto sobre a precificación e liquidez dos títulos, de tal forma de atraer novos emisores e investidores promovendo o desenvolvimento dese mercado. Esa é a nosa visão do desenvolvimento do mercado de bonos verdes, principalmente. Esperamos e desejo un grande suceso nas discusiones deste workshop. Moito obrigado outra vez por a súa participación e por a súa parcería neste moito noble proxecto de tentar facer este mercado un mercado moito máis sólido e resiliente. Bom dia a todos. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, senhor Juan Ketter, pelas suas palavras. Passo agora a palavra para o senhor Rafael Cavazzoni, especialista líder setorial de mercados financeiros da Divisão de Conectividade, Mercados e Finanças do BID, para coordenar o painel Mercado de Cover Bonds e European Secure Notes, Estrutura Regulatória e Perspectivas, que será ministrado em inglês. Lembro, mais uma vez, que perguntas podem ser encaminhadas pelo canal Q&A, o ícone aqui embaixo na tela, para consideração dos convidados ao fim do painel. E lembro também que o evento conta com tradução simultânea, basta acessar o ícone do globo terrestre também na parte inferior da tela. Rafael, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for being here today. Let me start by thanking Rodrigo Porto for his introduction and for all his efforts to make this webinar possible. It's truly a pleasure to be a part of today's panel with so many distinguished speakers. I think within the conceptual framework Juan Ketter described so well, our discussion today will be centered on the opportunity presented for the adoption of de-risking instruments to scale up sustainable finance. Cover bonds and secured notes can leverage much needed resources to areas of strategic relevance for a country such as Brazil and for other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. With everything going on in the world right now, I think it's easy to perceive a greater degree of risk around us. Banking and capital markets in particularly are also very sensitive to this. So discussing these de-risking instruments is not only strategic at this point in time, but perhaps a necessity. It should be of special interest to financial institutions here in Brazil and all over Latin America. Financial institutions and public banks with a development mandate in particular will be central to promoting conditions for generating employment and income, as well as financing investments that improve conditions for sustainable economic recovery and to promote growth. In this context, these institutions will be seeking alternatives to mobilize private resources and to promote a better financial management of their portfolios. In this context, the use of cover bonds and secured notes with a sustainable label can provide them with some important benefits, and I will name some of them. First, attractiveness to investors, given the intrinsic credit enhancement provided by a cover pool of assets that are offered in guarantee. Second, extension of funding terms and a better perspective on asset liability management. Third, alignment of the asset allocation to sustainable objectives which are linked to public policy priorities in their respective countries. And to conclude, four, legal certainty for the use of proceeds with increasing reputational benefits. With this in mind, and to make the case for the use in lack of these instruments, we brought you three of the world's most renowned experts in cover bonds and secured notes. So I'll try to introduce them. It's a brief introduction, and their curriculum, as you can imagine, is much broader than that, but I'll start. Luca Bertalotti is the Secretary General of the European Mortgage Federation and the European Cover Bond Council. In his capacity, Luca is also the consortium coordinator for the Energy Efficient Mortgage Initiative in Europe. Luca represents EU mortgage lenders and the cover bond community in discussions all over the world. Agustin Martin is the head of European credit research for BBVA in London. His team covers European banks, industrial corporates, public sector, and structured credit in general. In the cover bond space, Agustin is one of the most regarded analysts within Southern Europe. Finally, Richard Kemish is a high-level consultant specialized on the development of secure debt markets in developing economies. Richard spent 25 years in investment banks from Citi to JP Morgan. Richard also worked on the development of cover bond markets, largely in new jurisdictions, advising regulators and pioneer issuers all over the world. So as you see in a little bit, the presentations in today's panel will address some critical questions that were selected to guide the discussions. These critical questions are the following. First, why cover bonds and secured notes are so successful in some developed markets? And what has been done so far in those markets to incentivize the use of thematic labels within this industry? Third, how the European experience with these instruments could be replicated in emerging markets to help drive a sustainable recovery in the aftermath of the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And fourth, what are the key conditions that should be observed to lay the foundations for the development of this market in Brazil and in Latin America more broadly? So without much further ado, I'll pass it on to Luca, who will start, followed by Agustin, and then Richard. After the presentation, I hope to have a brief follow-up conversation and address some questions that I have prepared for them, and obtaining also some questions from the audience. So on to you, Luca, and again, thank you for the three of you to be here with us today.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and bon dia to everyone. And it's a great pleasure for me to be with you here. I think that this cross-regional cooperation is extremely important. We are facing very extraordinary times with an unprecedented crisis affecting the entire globe. The entire supply chain of our markets are under pressure, and we can only build a recovery if we work all together. The Paris Agreement, which was signed a few years ago, has called for a global cooperation on the ESG market developments, and we are fully committed to deliver global solutions, and our organization is trying to build bridges from Singapore, Seoul, Tokyo, Brussels, Brasilia, and New York in order to make sure that we will have a global coordination to tackle this unprecedented crisis. The crisis we are living will change our daily life. Most probably the day that we will go out from our houses, we will find a different labor market. We will find different cities, different economical trends. And the financial markets, they have to be ready to support the changes that we have to face. Countries, member states of the European Union cannot afford this huge effort only by using public money, but they need a strong contribution of capital markets. The European Union is trying to guide the capital markets in order to support the real economy as much as they can. They have used over the years the instrument of covered bonds to lead the mortgage market out of the crisis of 2008. And a few months ago, the European Union has agreed on a covered bond directive, which is a legislative benchmark for all the European countries, but also for all the countries outside Europe. Brazil has been very brave, is one of the first countries in South America who introduced a covered bond legislation, very strong. We see an active market. Several banks have started to issue private bonds, placement on covered bonds. We see more than 23 billion of reais already issued in Brazil, and banks like Itaú, Bradesco, Unibanco that are very active in this sector. So covered bonds can be a hope for the entire region. And we have already covered bond legislation in Peru, in Chile, in Panama. We see an active market. So the seed of capital markets, it's already in the region and can really help the market to develop. Why covered bonds? Why European secured notes? It's a capital market instrument which has the broadest investor base around the globe. Around the globe, we have more than 2.5 trillion of assets, and we have a very traditional base in Europe for long-term papers and institutional investors. But nowadays, all the central banks around the globe are investing in covered bonds. So the creation of this instrument will secure to your country a strong investor basis, long-term investor, helping in providing stability to the financial markets. Why covered bonds are considered so secure, and why this system of dual recourse, which is also applied to European secured notes, can be quite helpful for countries. This level of security is quite important from a financial stability point of view. It requires a due diligence for lenders, for consumers, and for investors, giving much more solid approach to capital markets for the entire country. It's perceived as an element of maturity, and investors, they feel if there are covered bonds, we can invest long-term in that country. So this will help your infrastructure, this will help your pension fund, this will help your middle class, because covered bonds is a driver to provide services to the middle class of a country. That's true for Germany, for Denmark, for Saudi Arabia, for Indonesia, for Brazil, and for whoever region wants to introduce covered bonds. We are speaking about a dual recourse instrument, but in reality, we have, I would say, a third level of security, which is the strategic importance of this instrument. You not only have a full recourse against the lender, so the issuer issuing covered bonds, and if the issuer default, you have the full protection of a covered pool of high quality asset with a dynamic covered pool protecting your interest. But on top of this, we have a third level of security, which is the strategic importance of covered bonds for the country. That's why no one had any doubt about the security of covered bonds during the crisis of 2008. and covered bonds were traded better than govies in several European countries in the middle of the crisis. When you are in the middle of the crisis, covered bonds can bring out the mortgage market for the crisis, and most probably can help you to build an exit strategy for bringing out capital markets from the crisis. But covered bonds are not only important for financial stakeholders, but are also very important for consumers, because they make their mortgages more secure, cheaper, and longer. It's easier to produce long-term papers that can help the market to produce mortgages of 25, 30 years, which is very comfortable for consumer and can reactivate the real economy. Now, this is the infrastructure. Allow me to play now with the colors. Let's play with colors. In Europe, in few weeks' time, the European Union will publish a very important document, which is the Taxonomy Delegate Act. I think this will be a global benchmark for changing the ESG world and increasingly massively the production of green bonds and green mortgages. We as an industry, we are ready to take action. We have already issued a green label for covered bonds and a green label for mortgages, because we want to give a clear indication to consumers that if they buy a green mortgages, they can renovate their house, they can have a tangible benefit by reducing their energy bill and improving the quality of their house. We have to redesign our cities. Most probably we have to renovate. We have calculated in Europe more than 200 million of dwellings. We can do it so only by creating very tangible benefit for consumers, for lenders, and for investors. There is only one element linking all these different stakeholders, is ESG covered bonds and ESG mortgages. That's why how you can build a green value chain, giving to every single stakeholders a win-win process to maximize the efficiency in the production line. Covered bonds are a solution for ESG, but not only. In Europe, we are using covered bonds and ESN also for social housing, for hospital and healthcare material, which is now strategically important for a lot of countries. We need to support the welfare system and provide more services to citizens. That's why covered bonds are so strategically important. Allow me to make you a very concrete example on why a green mortgage or a green covered bonds can help concretely a consumer, a lender, and an investor. In average, in Europe, we have considered that we have to help citizens to move the quality of the energy efficiency of 2 notches. As you know, in Europe, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G as category for our buildings. Actually, the quality of our buildings is squeezed down to D, E, and F. So every single family in Europe has to invest around 20,000 euros, around 25,000 of US dollars, to make a jump in their house. By doing so, they can really reduce their energy expenses of 50–70% and increase the value of their house of 5–10%. It depends on the kind of investment they will be doing. This is a fantastic opportunity for citizens to renovate their house, but also for the banks to improve massively the quality of their balance sheet, making their balance sheet much more secure, much more resilient to crisis, and helping them to reduce non-performing loans and make international investors more comfortable when they buy a covered bond. That's why ESG is a fantastic filter that can help our countries to keep strategic long-term investors in the country and to guide consumers toward a greener revolution. I would like to conclude here by saying that financial markets have been in the history always fundamental for helping a country to build a renaissance. We are in front of an unprecedented pandemic event. We all know that our world will be different. And after a pandemic event, the world needs to recover and need to build a renaissance. let's look at the Renaissance. I mean, how we can imagine the Renaissance without the contribution of the bankers. Leone X, the Pope who redesigned the Basilica of San Pietro, was a Medici, was a banker, who the Renaissance was built with the capital markets. The city of Paris was built with capital markets. The city of Berlin, the beauty of all our cities have been built with the support of capital markets. Now it's time to act all together. We want to build bridges with Brazil, with the entire region. Latin America is a fantastic opportunity because only together we can make the world better for our kids and build a sustainable future for all of us. With this, I would like to give the availability to our organization to support the development in Brazil and in South America, and to give all our ability to support your banks to make this transition, which is a fundamental element of change for our communities. Thank you, Rafael. I think that we have lost Rafael.
I might follow you, Luca, if that's okay. Okay. First, good morning, good evening from London. Bon dia, buenos días a todos. I would like to share some of the experiences that in Europe, and particularly in Southern Europe, I've had with the European secured notes. And what is the way we have advanced since, if I'm not wrong, we held the first meetings of European secured notes, if I'm not wrong, were in Milan, Italy in 2011. So it has been quite a long time from there. So I would like first to assess what's the current situation of the cover bonds and ESNs market in Europe, and particularly what is the issuers and investors' view of this instrument. Then I would like to move to briefly highlight what the EBA, the European Banking Association, says about European secured notes, although this part will be further detailed by Richard Gemisch. And the first block of my presentation is the focus on the rating agencies. At the end, it is critical, no, for the success of a new asset class, how rating agencies are going to qualify it, how rating agencies perceive these European secured notes. So I would like also to share some views regarding what's the initial assessment. I say initial because we haven't yet a specific European secured note issued. We have one precedent, a Commerzbank dual recourse SME cover bond in the past, but it's not really legally a European secured note. But it's important. All the major rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P has a preliminarily detailed how I'm going to look towards this instrument. So this is something that I think it's worthwhile to share with you. So going with the first slide of my presentation, which is ESN's European issuer view. Well, the obvious question is, I'm a Spaniard working for a Spanish bank. Spain, as you know, is one of the countries in Europe with the highest exposure to SMEs. This has been traditionally seen as a weakness of the Spanish economy whenever there is economic slowdown. Just to give you some figures, and according to the latest statistics available, Spain has roughly 95% of SMEs, which is significant above the average of the European Union, which include 66%, 2/3 of the total employment in Spain from the private sector, and 61% of the gross value added of the Spanish sector. 3/4 of these SMEs are linked to the services sector, although there are significant exposure, as you know, to real estate and construction, which makes roughly 10 to 15% of the SMEs. This figure was much higher in the years of the housing bubble in Spain in the 2000 to 2009 period. So, when the great financial crisis started in 2008-2009, the impact was felt in Spain a bit later, from 2010, but it was a dramatic one. we have half of the Spanish banking system with severe solvency problems, the so-called Spanish saving banks, the Spanish cajas, and of course, the first one of the dynamics we saw from Spanish banks during this tough period of time in order to contain the increase of non-performing loans was to deleverage massively. So lending to SMEs particularly suffer a lot. And as a result of that, this created a major financial crisis in Spain, with unemployment going to figures close to 30% at some point, and with the destruction of hundreds of thousands of SMEs during this period. So we were talking about this period. It came natural to some of us, and of course led by the European Covered Bond Council, to think about, well, during all this period of time, we have seen the covered bond, the residential mortgage covered market working very well. During a significant period of time in 2007, 8, and 9 was the only funding instrument that European bank or a number of European banks have available. So it's a pity that we don't have a similar instrument for SMEs, because the consequences is that we wouldn't have seen such a dramatic decline in bank lending to SMEs, and as a second stage, all the dramatic social and economic consequences we saw there. So all this effort, all the way of the European secured note, come from this starting point. The obvious question is, okay, it really makes sense. From the issuer's point of view, a lot of Spanish banks, they saw a huge widening in the spread gap between the covered bonds and the senior debt. So obviously there were spread space, I mean, for a new asset class. And from the investor's point of view, and of course, depending on the regulatory treatment of this instrument, that Richard will go later in more detail, but it might not be so different as the one we are used to. Covered bonds, definitely investors in covered bonds would be interested into this product. So the question now is, why, with all these favorable conditions, we haven't seen yet a proper development of European secured notes? First, because during a significant period of time, it was mainly an initiative from a specific number of countries, particularly from Southern Europe, which were more focused on developing European secured notes with SMEs collateral, while the interest of banks in core European countries could be either okay with the European secured notes, but more for the infrastructure loans perspective. There were also some caveats regarding whether European secured notes could tarnish the extremely historically good reputation of covered bonds. And of course, last but not least, and this has been the main driver, we have had the European central banks providing European banks with term liquidity during the successive TLTROs. We are already in the fourth iteration of the TLTROs. The idea of the ECB before the pandemic, of course, was begin to progressively leave this role of liquidity term provider to capital markets, which is the place where it should be. But then the coronavirus pandemic started, and the ECB was forced to tweak the conditions of the TLTRO4 to make it again extremely favorable for banks. So this is a reason why European secured notes haven't seen life as a public instrument in the market, and also covered bonds have been suffering the consequences of these policies, with a significant decrease in super bonds in public format in a number of countries in Europe. Needless to say, this TLTRO cycle will end at some point. Particularly the ECB was quite clear before the pandemic to begin to, let's say, make the conditions of the TLTRO4 less attractive than the previous one, in order to foster banks to go back to capital markets and use covered bonds as a funding instrument. So that means that although as of today European banks are not in a liquidity stress situation, in addition to that, we have the MREL requirements, which focus European banks to issue bail-enabled debt, like senior non-preferred or deeply subordinated financial debt. But at some point, when the TLTROs are when we move towards a scenario of more normalized rates in Europe, I can tell you that in addition, of course, to see an increase in covered bond supply, we will see European secured notes as a new funding asset class. So it's true that the dynamics of the markets in the last years and the monetary policy have delayed all this process, but the appetite is there. ESNs were specifically mentioned in the European Union Covered Bond Directive. There is a hell of work done about how this instrument would work, structures, etc. So definitely this is something that we expect to happen in Europe, developing at some point in the next years. So next slide, please. So moving on to the next slide, and I will be very brief here. So we have the starting point, which was the concern mostly from Southern European banks regarding to avoid the mistakes of the previous financial crisis, and therefore to mitigate the impact on SMEs and the impact on the society of any significant economic slowdown period. So the second major point was the EBA, the European Banking Association, looking the feasibility of this instrument in detail. So at the end, the conclusions were that ESNs in areas, the best practices for covered bonds can be applied to ESNs, but of course with some tweaks, with some additional criteria regarding covered pool composition and diversification, because of course we are talking about a different collateral. SMEs are different collateral than residential mortgages. Of course, higher requirements in terms of minimum over collateralization and liquidity coverage, stricter disclosure requirements. And one of the main messages from the EBA, and which is clearly included in the European Union Covered Bond Directive, is that there should be a clear distinction between ESNs and covered bonds. Provided all this setting, and with the additional requirements I have mentioned before, ESNs could enjoy some, but not all, of the covered bonds regulatory or preferred regulatory treatment. So the only exception here being liquidity coverage ratio. So moving into the next slides, I have summarized what the main rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, and S&P think about European secured notes. I would summarize the content. You can also go deeper into these slides if necessary, but there are like 3-4 main messages I would like to share. The first one is that European secured notes backed by SME loans are not necessarily riskier or a worse instrument from the rating perspective than the traditional covered bonds. Of course, provided some structural features and eligibility criteria are provided. So, for example, it's quite straightforward to see that there should be potentially some limits in the terms of concentration to specific sectors, concentration to specific names. OC or credit enhancement should be higher in European secured notes than in traditional covered bonds, the same way that credit enhancement in senior tranche of SMEs, ABS are higher than in residential mortgage-backed security. And there is something that all the three rating agencies see as a basic requisite for European secured notes, which is providing maturity extension mechanisms, either loans of bullets or conditional pass-throughs, given that this collateral is much more liquid than residential mortgages. Then these type of extension maturities, which are becoming quite popular also in traditional covered bonds, should be an inherent feature of this instrument in order to achieve the maximum rating uplift of this instrument in comparison with the rating of the issue. Moving to the next slide, and just to finish my the preliminary part, you can here have some comparisons between SMEs and residential and RMBS, which I think can be really applied to a European secured note. You can see that in terms of SMEs, ABS, you can see that usually the credit enhancement that credit rating agencies to have the top rating in the senior tranche is something from 20 to 30%, which is aligned with the recommended OC level that the EBA saw us for this instrument in with the collateral of SME loans. Of course, there are different key factors to play that at the end, the final rating of a European secured note will depend on the expected targeted loss level. I mean, the rating you are aiming to, the issuer credit strength, of course, the credit quality of the SME pool, and the refinancing risk mitigating factor. So here, this table provided by Moody's provided with very clear terms. Now, if we are focusing on, let's say, a top rating for the European secured note, this is from the European perspective, of course. So we are targeting a expected loss level of 0.005%, which is equivalent to a AAA rating. You can see that the amount of over-collateralization requested depends a lot on the, of course, the quality of the SME pool, which is the credit enhancement, 14.5% against 19, and also depends a lot on if there is some refinancing risk provisions included. I mean, if there is some type of maturity extensions. For example, for issuer with a A3 rating, issuer rating, you can see that for the same credit enhancement, 19%, which is the usual average one in Europe, if the ESN includes extension maturities, the requested over-collateralization would be around 15%. If it's not the case, will be above 30%, which this is one of the critical factors that all rating agencies point as critical in order to achieve the maximum rating for ESNs. Of course, and to sum up from my end, all rating agencies, the three of them, explicitly say that they will apply the covered bond rating criteria to evaluate European secured notes, given the similarities of this product and the dual purpose instrument in comparison with the traditional mortgage covered bonds. The only difference, of course, is that when they analyze the intrinsic quality of the collateral, they will use a specific SME CLOs techniques, because those are the techniques they have developed to evaluate the SME collateral. But apart from that, there is, and again, I highlight, provided that there is the structural features that accommodate for the specific features of SME loans, there is nothing intrinsically negative or intrinsically different from a European secured note in comparison with a mortgage covered bond from the rating agency's perspective, in the sense that when they approach this instrument to qualify. So this is my initial read here. So now, Richard, please, if you want to enlighten us more about the European secured notes, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Agustin. Thank you, Luca. I had an intermittence before. Go ahead, Richard, and then we're going to have a round of questions and answers. So if anybody on the audience wants to send us over, we already received some questions. We can include them on the discussion after all.
Great. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you also to all of your colleagues for organizing this event. I think that in these times, it's so important to be having this kind of dialogue. I really wish that I was there in Sao Paulo or Rio right now, but we can't be, so this is second best. But thank you. And good morning to everybody. I'd like to take a little bit of a step back. We talk a lot so far about covered bonds and ESNs, European secured notes, as if they're the same thing. And they're actually very different things. And I just want to differentiate. Covered bonds are an extremely large, an extremely old, an extremely successful market. And because of that, they're a deeply conservative market. ESNs are a fledgling idea, a new idea that is potentially going to finance a lot of assets which really need to be financed by the application of technology that has been developed in the covered bond market. Now, so far we talk about covered bonds. I think Luca mentioned green covered bonds. What do we mean when we say a green covered bond? A green covered bond is a covered bond, absolutely. It is backed by assets that are, in many ways, the same There are perhaps residential mortgages eligible for all covered bond programs. They're structured within the same law. They just happen to have an additional quality of environmental criteria. Now, I'm very pleased that they exist, but they're a small subset of all mortgages. For that matter, they're a small subset of the assets which we need to refinance. There are many, many assets out there which are green, which do not conform to any definition of eligible assets. There are also many assets out there that are sustainable and important. Loans to small and medium-sized enterprises are by far the most commonly spoken about, so we'll concentrate on that. They are not eligible for covered bonds, but covered bond technology could be applied to them. That's the idea of ESNs. And to many people, it's quite a shocking idea. You know, this is a very successful market. All my career, I've been working in this wonderful covered bond market, and it's worked very well. What am I doing changing it? Why should I change it now? In this presentation, I'd like to speak a little bit about the big picture of what currently backs covered bonds, and much more importantly, why. When you ask that question, you talk a little bit about the history of the debate about what should be backing covered bonds. You start to come to some important implications, some important questions you need to ask. We're going to try to apply this technology. So as we see on this slide, the covered bond market is very large. It's about 2.7 trillion euros, about 3.2, 3.3 trillion US dollars. The vast majority of covered bonds outstanding are backed by mortgages. Most of those are residential mortgages. When I go to a new country, start talking about why they should have a covered bond market, what benefits the covered bond market should have, the conversation always starts off with home loans, residential mortgages. It's much easier to start a conversation when you have something residential mortgage as your starting point. It's, you know, be cynical about it, they're voters' mortgages, important to society. There's a very substantial second class. It used to be much larger, and that shares many of the same characteristics. It's more for me to put the word in, so I'll just put ES, which stands for public sector. Public sector loans are used in some jurisdictions, not many, not most by all means, as an equally eligible asset backing covered bonds. And the really important question is why? Why covered bonds applied to those asset classes? The simple, the facetious answer maybe is tradition. They've always been backed on those asset classes. Now, I'm English, I love a good tradition, but it's not really good enough to be the basis for the development of the market going forward. Perhaps more importantly, they're very good assets. In almost every country you look at, the best assets in that country are either the residential mortgages or the public sector, the government itself. Now, that's quite a good argument, but it has a flaw, and that's this. If you look at securitization, securitization's all you get is the asset. If you look at covered bonds, you get the asset, you get recourse to the bank. If it was all about the quality of the assets, it should really be the other way around, that securitization should be limiting themselves to high quality assets, and covered bonds, where you have that added protection, should be thinking about riskier assets, but it isn't. The covered bond market is inherently more conservative in terms of asset quality. So I don't think the good assets argument stands up. I think far more important to the debate about eligibility are these second points. What is an important asset, and how easy are they to work with? Are they easy to value? Do they exist for a long time? Are they nice assets? Right? I grew up as a structurer doing these things. Some assets are just naturally easier to work with. Public sector and residential mortgages are easy assets to work with when you're structuring a bond. I think these are, for me, the two things on what should be in a covered bond, and perhaps by extension, what should be in a new application of covered bond technology, such as ESNs. Agustin mentioned the EBA report on ESNs, and I think an important point is that they looked at two asset classes only, SME loans and infrastructure loans. And infrastructure, they both passed that first test. They're both very important to a country. But only SME loans passed the second test, being easy. Loans were more difficult. So the EBA said, not a good idea. They don't like the concept of project using this technology. I'd just like to say on the other side of this, I refer here to official covered bond. What does official mean? Well, some countries define what a covered bond is. Some say you're not allowed to say bonds, but really you can call anything a covered bond. You could do a credit card securitization, give recourse and say, hey, it's a covered bond, isn't it? People have done that. I think more importantly, the definition of covered bonds boils down to three things. It boils down to a set of rules about how covered bonds should be treated for investors. There are many, many rules in the European Union, less in other jurisdictions where covered bonds are less of a track record to justify this. But they talk about things like the capital risk for a bank investor, the eligibility for liquidity cover ratios, whether pension funds are allowed to buy them, those kind of rules about the prudential treatment of the asset class. The second way that the asset class defines itself is how the investor thinks about the market. When an investor is a covered bond investor, he talks about the mandate, asset manager, the mandate from the people giving the money, only invest in covered bonds. He talks about the indices that he's measured against. The iBox covered bond index is my benchmark. If I beat that, I can do anything. And the third one is perhaps the most important one if you're looking at developing a market, the legal help. A lot of countries, most countries, passed covered bond laws, and a couple of countries have passed ESN laws, not with that name, but with effectively ESN laws. And that's the most important thing within those ESN laws is that the legal system is giving you help to structure bonds in this way. Help in asset transfer, help in supervisory processes, help in all of the other features that make it easy to structure a covered bond. You don't always need those features. It makes life a lot easier if you have them. It makes investors a lot happier if they've got that. I just want to mention one other thing on this slide. You probably didn't notice it at first, but there's an incredibly small third block in there. Too small for me to even put a label in it. It's slightly less than 10 billion euros, which is much less than 1% of the total market. Arguably, it's less than 1%. It's irrelevant. But it isn't totally irrelevant because perhaps creates a precedent, the idea that we can have other asset classes. Now, so far, it's a historical accident. It's mainly mortgages on ships in Denmark. Yeah, big deal. But it creates the idea that you can actually start to apply cover bond technology outside the traditional areas. If we can take a look at the next slide. One of the first questions that you always ask is, why do you need covered bonds? Surely there are lots and lots of residential mortgages, and in Europe that's absolutely true. There are about 7 trillion euros worth of residential mortgages in Europe, and about 2.4 trillion of those are in covered bond pools. So you've got 4.6 trillion of mortgages just sitting around waiting for something to do. It's not quite that simple, of course. There are perhaps 2 main reasons why it's not that simple, and one, let's say, one futuristic reason. The 2 main reasons are that, firstly, those mortgages aren't evenly distributed. Europe's a very diverse continent. A number of mortgages in the system is extremely high in some countries, nearly 100% of GDP in the Netherlands, extremely low in other countries. In Bulgaria and Romania, it's about 8%. I think is roughly the same percentage as it is in Brazil currently. Whereas overall, there are probably enough assets on an average to go around. That certainly isn't the case in every country. I do a lot of work in countries that don't have very developed mortgage markets, and the conversation about using other assets is always much stronger there than it is in countries like the Netherlands or the UK or France, where there are plenty of assets to go around. A second thing, and this is a trend which has accelerated with the pandemic, is of the mortgages out there, the 4.6 trillion of spare mortgages, if you like, an awful lot of them are already used somewhere for some form of collateral. Quite a lot of them are in securitization. Quite a lot of them are used as raw assets, unpackaged assets, in other forms of collateral agreement. One of the implications of the Basel rules, one of the implications of central bank repo funding, one of the implications of clearing houses is all banks need a lot more collateral than they used to the extent that it's becoming a major problem, I believe, for systemic risk and for the overall banking system. And the third point that I'd like to make is that not all mortgages are very good. Some of them from a credit point of view, some of them from a high loan-to-value ratio, some of them have regulatory impediments. And this is a problem which is increasing massively because of COVID. An awful lot of countries have introduced payment holidays, moratoria, debt forgiveness, which perhaps says maybe residential mortgages aren't as good as. Let's move on, if I can, to the next slide. And this is one that Augustine has already spoken about a little bit. We've been having this conversation already for 10 years. There are some precedents before 2017, 2018, where we started to have the conversation. It only really got real, though, when the European Commission was working on the covered bond directive and saying, should other asset classes be allowed? Now, they asked the EBA that question. They asked me that question. I wrote a report on them. We didn't always see eye to eye, I would say, the EBA and myself. I think that I'm more optimistic about this asset class. There are potentials where it could work better for some countries than covered bonds, but it didn't make it into the covered bond directive. The covered bond directive was passed. It made the covered bond market much better. It's currently being transposed into law. And this year, there are two fundamental things that are happening. The Commission has said, new Parliament has said, okay, we've done the directive, what's next? What is the next thing that covered bond technology can do in order to enhance, improve Europe's economy? Therefore, the debate comes back to the ESM. The second one, of course, the massive one, the one which we're always thinking about, the human tragedy of COVID is a major thing that we can never dismiss. It also has some very important economic implications. Greater dependence on collateral, a greater house price inflation in many countries, which is more concerns amongst investors about that asset class. But most importantly, a huge growth in importance in loans to small and medium-sized enterprises in particular. To finish the history thing, I don't want to go on too long. I know there are lots of questions already. I just want to ask you to put one date in your diary, July the 8th, 2024. Two really important things happen on that day. The first is that the European Commission, by that date, has to report on rules for the equal treatment by European investors of covered bonds in other countries. If we all get it right, Brazilian covered bonds will be equal in their treatment to German covered bonds, to French covered bonds, Italian covered bonds, by that date. And the second one is, by that date, Parliament has asked the European Commission to come up with a report on European secured notes, identifying what should happen next. And ideally, these things should always be led by the market. The Commission can't invent this. The market invents it, the Commission follows. I'm going to move on quickly. The next slide talks about the idea of, okay, covered bond technology is great. What do we apply it to? Well, there's two basic answers. Either we stay silent and it's entirely up to you, market participants, to decide what the underlying asset should be. That doesn't work. That doesn't work for many reasons. It doesn't work for conservatism that I mentioned, inherent in the market. It doesn't work for the need for supervisory processes. It's many reasons why. Much more importantly, a list of specific assets. And the three assets that we speak about all the time are the three that I've mentioned on this slide already. Loans to small and medium-sized enterprises, project infrastructure loans, and green loans that aren't in themselves eligible for existing covered all very different conversations. They're all very important conversations. Now, we talk about SMEs. They met those twin guidelines that I mentioned earlier. They're good assets, they're good to work with, but they still present some problems. How do you define exactly what an SME is? An SME in Brazil is probably very different from an SME in Italy, is probably a very different from an SME in Indonesia. How do you define what a good SME is? In covered bonds, a good mortgage is quite easy. It's very easy to define a simple rule of thumb, which is a loan to value ratio. What's the equivalent of exposure for small or medium-sized enterprises? That's not clear. It's something which has to be defined by the market, by conversations like these. Project infrastructure loans, I don't want to dwell on that. They are complicated, they are big, they are important. The EBA thought that it was impossible. I think that it's impossible with current covered bond technology, which is built around granular, high-quality assets. But that doesn't mean there aren't some form of dual recourse instruments that can be applied to loans to finance important infrastructure projects. It's very much in the spirit of a market which cooperates between public and private sector assets. More work needs to be done. Green loans, well, I think that goes without saying. We have debates about the definitions of green loans, of course. How to define quality metrics. What your idea of green is might not be the same as what my idea of green is, but it's important. We can't ignore that as a potential asset class. And so on the final page, and I know that Raphael, I know that you're champing at the bit there to ask questions, but the final page that I'd just like to leave you with is about the big questions. If you want to create an ESN market for SMEs, for green loans, for project infrastructure, there are some very fundamental questions you need to ask. And I don't want to give you the answer. I don't know Brazil as well as anybody on this call does. So I simply want to ask questions. How do you do that without diluting this wonderful product of bonds that you have in Brazil? We like the way that it's developed in Brazil. It seems to be going extremely well. It's gone phenomenally well for 250 years in Europe. How do you use that technology without diluting that very powerful brand, which is bonds? How do you define the assets? How can you as a market define assets that meet those criteria, being important and being easy to work with? Do ESNs deserve a favorable treatment for investors? Investors should get favorable treatment favorable treatment in many ways. I mentioned earlier, rates, eligibility criteria, whatever. How many of those are necessary? How many of them are justified for a newly started asset class? And what do you need to help from a legal regulatory point of view? What legal changes do you need to make in order to facilitate? So I leave it at that. I know that, Raphael, I know you want to ask lots of questions. Please.
Thank you, Richard. Very inspirational and very interesting, the perspective. I think now we're going to get to the Q&A session. I'll try to address a few of the questions, perhaps one for each, and then one takeaway that you can perhaps bring to all the audience in how to think about this going forward. So I'll start with you, Luca, and bring some of the questions that we received from the audience. But like, if Brazil or other emerging market in LAC is willing to develop a green or a sustainable covered bond secured note framework, what would be your core advice to build it the right way? And piggybacking on that, how the European Council of Covered Bonds has helped the European market to think about labels. How you see covered bonds being used, for instance, for water and sanitation, which is a hot topic here in Brazil. That will be a huge market, a huge need for finance here. Perhaps hospital infrastructure. Is this something that the covered bond market in Europe is thinking about, and how it is thinking about? If you could let us know.
Yes, I mean, public sector cover bonds, Rafael, are extremely important in Europe. They were actually the starting point of the cover bonds, because cover bonds become very famous when they were used to refinance the infrastructure in Germany after the reunification. So that is the starting point of our global story. In Europe, we have this kind of category, which is not present in the Brazilian legislation, where you can finance all the public sector asset. This option is helping now countries to finance, for example, hospitals, medical care, and medical materials or sanitation elements, which is extremely important. I mean, last year, CAFIL, one of the major French issuers, they did what they call a social bond, but in reality was full of medical support elements to support exactly the hospitals in France, which were hugely under pressure because of the COVID transaction. In Germany now, we call this also white cover bonds because of the medical aspect. I mean, there are several banks thinking about this. In Germany, there is, for example, the Bank for the Pharmacy that is developing this kind of structure, and the public sector element is really helpful in this kind of transaction. So maybe there is room to maneuver and to think about this option also in the Brazilian legislation, which is consider a very solid and very good legislation. Concerning your first question about ESG, I will suggest we have already standards that we are under implementation. There is an ESG section for investors. We're working at global level, so we really investigate with investors what are their needs, what are their parameters. So we really recommend the Brazilian community or the South American, Latin American community to follow the best practices used in the cover bond label. I think that's is an international benchmark, and everyone is following this kind of structure. Doesn't make any sense to do something different, which will not be understood by the investors. So we are happy to support, to include our Brazilian friends. I think ABCIP has been always very much involved in our discussion. Felipe is playing a very important role in our global issue working group. And I think that Brazil has a good opportunity also to attract international investors. I would like to underline this, that European investors are desperate for getting a bit of yield. I mean, and this is a fantastic window of opportunity for Brazil to step in the most traditional long-term investor base. I'm pretty sure that if Brazil will issue good paper in the coming months or coming years, a lot of German investors, French investors will be ready to jump on it and enter in this space. So let's work together. That's the only thing that I can say, Rafael.
Thank you, Luca. Very nice. And I think we'll rely a lot on your experience and your guidance through the process as we think about this. But piggybacking on one of the topics that you just mentioned, which is the desire for yield in Europe, I'll ask Agustin. Agustin, how you truly see investors' appetite for this kind of instrument in emerging markets? What are the trade-offs that you see as you add country risk to cover bonds and so on? And another thing that comes up a lot in conversations is if cover bonds or ESMs were implemented in a market such as Brazil, would you expect it to have a negative impact on the local unsecured senior issuances on a corporate market? How you see those two markets playing out with each other?
Thanks, Rafael. Regarding investor appetite for Brazilian or emerging markets cover bonds, this is something that it has been on the cards for many years, I could say. It's true that one of the successes of cover bonds in the last decade has been a globalization, but it has been a globalization trend mostly in developed economies. So the emerging market cover bonds right now are limited to Turkey, and even supply from there is limited, and also Turkey is subject not to significant bouts of volatility given let's say, the changes in the monetary policy from the Turkish central banks, like the ones we have seen a few days ago. So definitely bear in mind that right now 90% of the European covered bonds are in negative yields. So I'm not saying positive yields, I'm saying negative, and in some cases deeply negative yields. It's true that the situation has improved somewhat in the last couple of months, because the 10-year bond is at minus 0.3 and it was a few months ago at minus 0.6. But in any case, we are talking about that instead of 90% of the covered bonds with negative yields, we're having something like 80 or 80 something percent. So this has created, let's say, complicated investor dynamics. First of all, there are still private investors that are reluctant to buy covered bonds with negative yields. This is the reason why we have seen the tenor of covered bonds extending over and over again during the last years. Before this, let's say, anomalous situation, but we have been several years in Europe with this. Traditionally, the tenor of covered bonds was somewhere 7 to 10 in peripheral countries, somewhat shorter in core European countries because residential mortgages have less duration there. But now, what we have seen in the last couple of years, and not just with covered bonds, also in the sub-sovereign space, is that a significant increase in ultra tenor loans. We have even had 100-year bonds from Austria. Spanish regions have been issuing on private format bonds with 30 to 50 years maturity, and the driver of all of these extremely long durations, that a significant part of the European investor base is yield driven, so they cannot invest below a certain level of yield. So it was a very obvious question. They told the issuer, I need this yield, so go to whatever duration you need to provide me with this yield. The negative consequence of all of these, durations have increased significantly, and as we have seen in the last couple of months, we are back, particularly in the US, but also to some extent in Europe. We are in a rising rates scenario. There is growing aversion to duration risk, and therefore the situation is a bit more complex here. So definitely, taking into account the situation of the European or the large part of the European covered bond market in terms of negative yields, investors would really appreciate something from an asset class that, as Richard mentioned, is extremely well known, and at least on the main features, the structure, but definitely they need some positive yields to have the possibility to offer some return here. What have been doing investors in the last year? They have been increasing their exposure to covered bonds outside the covered bond purchase program. From the ECB, they have been buying Canadians, they have been buying Scandis, they have been buying Australians, they have been buying Koreans, they have been buying Singaporeans, but to some extent, I have to say the amount the amount of opportunities is limited. So definitely, LATAM covered bonds would be definitely plus for a lot of traditional covered bond investors, I could say. Regarding the coexistence between senior and secured debt and covered bonds in local markets, I know that this issue was raised by South Africa a few years ago. Honestly, from my point of view, I think that taking into account the evolution of the banking resolution directives, which are global directives to a large extent, I think that is clear and clear, or more clear and clear by the day, that covered bonds and senior unsecured debt are essentially different instruments with essentially differentiated investor bases. So personally, I do not see any risk of collusion or cannibalization or negative spillover between both asset classes.
Thank you, Agustin. Very interesting perspective. I think those are important questions as we think this forward. We're getting short on time. I'll give Richard one shot now, which is in your presentation, you mentioned some emerging markets like Turkey, for instance. Can you provide us with your view, Richard, as you work in developing these markets around the world? How you see the conditions in Brazil and Mexico, for instance, relative to those markets? The letra garantida LIG no Brazil, is this something that you think was implemented successfully, and how we can scale that up to find relative success? And there is a question on the audience, which is if you have some empirical evidence of how the availability of a covered bond market in a certain country drove, for instance, mortgage availability. You have about 5 to address those, and then I'll close with one question in general for a takeaway, and we pass it on to Maria.
Sure. Thank you. So to the first question, I'm probably the least qualified person to talk about how good the Brazilian covered bond law is. Everything I've heard about it has been extremely positive, though, including from rating agencies, including from investors. I think I completely agree with Agustin that there is demand for it. Some countries are more successful than others. The Turkish covered bond market has been held back by a lack of development in some financial market infrastructure, in particularly the derivatives. It's very difficult to enter into Turkish lira swaps in order to issue in euros. It's been held back by extreme political volatility there. It's a very extreme case of political volatility. Overcome those things, and I'm sure it will be much better received. And yeah, I can only echo Agustin's comments. And everything that I've heard that's been positive so far about the developments in Brazil. Let me answer that second question as well, though. Of the new jurisdictions, no, there hasn't yet been evidence that the development of a covered bond market has actually encouraged a mortgage market. Where is the causation, though? In some countries, the mortgage market encourages covered bonds. Perhaps it works the other way. Quite often, you start from a point of view of not needing covered bonds because you have a healthy loan deposit ratio and a small mortgage market. When the mortgage market grows rapidly, then a covered bond market is necessary, or an upgraded, internationalized covered bond market is necessary. I'm thinking there in particular of Slovakia and Poland. In both of those cases, you went from an extremely small and dysfunctional covered bond market and a very small mortgage market to very vibrant and very successful both mortgage markets and covered bond markets. In both cases, the mortgage market in Slovakia, I think, more than tripled in the case of 8 years. In Poland, it was not far behind that, and covered bonds more than doubled over the same time period. Perhaps if you want to go back a little bit further, the Spanish market, I'll go back a long way now to when about the early 2000s, when interest rates started coming down, affordability of mortgages in Spain improved very, very rapidly. The cédulas hipotecarias, the Spanish covered bond market, grew extremely rapidly. And actually, yes, that was pretty much lockstep the growth of the mortgage market there. I was there, I was selling a lot of those bonds, and there was a very clear case, as it is now, of German investors saying, we badly need covered bonds that look like covered bonds, that feel like covered bonds, that there aren't enough of them in Germany. Bring us something with yield, bring us something which is structured like a covered bond, and we will buy it. The number of cédulas, Agustin probably knows the numbers off the top of his head, but the number of cédulas that were issued over the space of a very short time period, 5 or 6 years, mainly funded the growth of the mortgage market in Spain in that period. So there is empirical evidence that the two of them have to go hand in hand.
Thank you, Richard. We are really out of time. I wish we had more. I think your presentation addressed what I had as a final part of this panel, which is what are the critical questions for us to think the implementation of this. So I'll leave the audience with those questions as takeaway, and I'll move forward. I truly hope you found the panel today interesting, as I did. I think there is a lot left that we could address in a follow-up. But this is a topic that I have been studying for quite some time, and I really believe it could be a game changer here in Brazil. For that reason, I would like to take this opportunity to announce that we will be launching in a few days a discussion paper that lays out a concept for a letra de desenvolvimento sustentável, or in English, a sustainable development bond for Brazil. Essentially, we are proposing to establish a new financial instrument that adapts the typical guarantee structure of a covered bond currently associated here in Brazil to the issuance of the Letra Imobiliária Garantida, the LIG, to facilitate financing of operations in strategic economic sectors that support sustainable economic development. Proposing a new financial instrument aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, provide for a wide range of eligible activities and projects. Essentially, it put forward one more source of funding to finance Brazil's green investment potential of $1.3 trillion. It would also put forward a key instrument to support lending to MSMEs, a segment that represents approximately 99.8% of the total number of companies, 58% of the formalized jobs, and 44.3% of the formal work wage bill in this country, and should be central to Brazil's economic recovery in the following years. We expect to bring this concept for discussion in the Financial Innovation Lab very soon. I hope we could rely on Richard, Agustin, Luca as part of this discussion. And I hope truly that many of you in the audience will join and help us think about how we could implement it here in Brazil and beyond throughout LAC. So thank you again to all of you for being here today. Rodrigo, I hand it back to you. Thank you.
Obrigado, Rafael. Agradecendo aos panelistas, agora mudando para o português, convido já a senhora Maria Neto, especialista principal setorial de mercados financeiros da Divisão de Conectividade, Mercados e Finanças, o BID, para as palavras finais de encerramento deste webinar. Maria.
Obrigado, Rodrigo. Foi um grande prazer participar desse webinar. Eu estou aqui, na verdade, não só como representante do Banco Interamericano, mas, na verdade, todos os parceiros que abriram esse evento, né? A GIZ, a Associação Brasileira de Bancos de Desenvolvimento, a BDE, e também os colegas, obviamente, de longa data da CVM. Essa agenda, eu acho, em particular, essa conversa hoje faz parte de uma agenda importante do Laboratório de Inovação Financeira, que vem trabalhando desde 2018 para tentar transformar um pouco o sistema financeiro brasileiro e integrar nesse sistema a questão da sustentabilidade. Em particular, de fato, a gente tem um grupo de trabalho que só trata das questões de financiamento verde, que vem olhando a questão de taxonomia e que vem olhando também a questão de instrumentos financeiros. A ideia e o ponto dos covered bonds, aqui retomando, muito importante o ponto que o Juan Ketter ressalta, que é um posicionamento do BID, mas que também é um posicionamento que está sendo tratado no LAB, que é importantíssimo a gente poder encontrar uma forma de desenvolver o mercado de capitais brasileiro, que ainda é um mercado relativamente pequeno comparado com outros mercados, e que os títulos temáticos, em particular o potencial de títulos verdes e sustentáveis, tem um potencial muito importante que a gente já está vendo crescer no Brasil, mas que deve, e a gente tem que encontrar a forma, ser, digamos, alavancado de forma exponencial. E uma parte importante desse mercado não avançar, entre outras coisas, é a questão de percepção de fato de risco e encontrar formas de tratar gestão de risco. E, nesse sentido, a discussão sobre covered bonds é muito importante. O Luca fala da renascença, o toque italiano bem interessante, que eu acho que é importante para nós. O Brasil está precisando pensar muito seriamente nessa renascença, com uma crise muito forte econômica da Covid, e repensar justamente como é que a gente pode usar esses mecanismos de título, não só como hoje, né, digamos, mais a visão mais tradicional justamente de ativos na área de habitação, passar realmente a ver outros tipos de ativos. Eu acho que essa mensagem é crucial tanto para a infraestrutura como micro, pequenas e médias empresas, que é o grande passo aqui para a nossa região e para a América Latina, mas também para o Brasil. Então, no LAB, eu acho que além do trabalho que a gente tem de taxonomia de instrumentação financeira, tem todo um trabalho que está sendo feito no grupo de investimento de impacto sobre novas formas de promover financiamento às micro, pequenas e médias empresas, a gente vem olhando o investimento de impacto, como é que a gente pode vincular isso também como uma oportunidade. Eu acho que aqui saiu, pelo menos para mim, um tema muito inspirador. Saíram também muito fortes as mensagens, tanto do Augustin como do Richard, sobre a questão de labeling, né? E a questão também da gente não desenvolver uma coisa aqui que não comunique com ali, né? Então, acho que assim, a gente vai seguramente pedindo aí para o Richard, para o Augustin também de continuar conversando com a gente, porque eu acho que tem muito que aprender sobre o que já está sendo feito lá fora, para normalmente realmente não replicar. E eu acho que esse tem sido o sentido do Lab, tá? A ideia do Lab justamente é aprender o que está sendo feito, por isso que a gente está organizando esse tipo de eventos, para poder desenvolver no Brasil práticas que possam ser adaptadas à realidade lá fora, tá? Então, assim, esse é um primeiro de vários webinários, a gente tem muitos webinários que vão ser programados esse ano, eu já queria até anunciar que a gente está planejando aí um outro webinário para tratar o tema de taxonomias, tá? Toda essa questão dos títulos sustentáveis, a gente tem alguns webinários que devem vir, por favor, também fiquem ligados aqui no Lab com relação a isso, tá? Mais que nada, agradecer de novo a participação do Luca, do Richard, do Agostinho, do Juan Ketterer, o Rafael aí está fazendo um trabalho extraordinário com o Rodrigo também, tentando desenvolver justamente uma proposta brasileira, né? E agradecer não mais a todos os parceiros com quem a gente tem sempre o prazer de trabalhar aqui no Lab. E terminar com isso, Rodrigo, vamos para frente, que tem muito trabalho, e eu acho que aqui a gente saiu disso com uma lição de várias coisas desse trabalho em Covered Bonds que pode ser importante para o trabalho do Laboratório de Inovação Financeira. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado, Maria. Agradecendo a todos, agradecendo a presença de todos neste webinar. Destaco que o evento foi gravado e estará disponível nos sites que a gente colocou no chat. Desejamos um ótimo dia, com muita saúde e trabalho produtivo a todos. Tchau.